How long can two people who love each other go without speaking, each of them certain the whole time that the silence belongs to the other one? It sounds like it should be a short answer. A week, you'd think? A month, if the hurt was real? Surely no one who actually loved you could let it run past a year. But it is not a short answer, and that is the strange and quiet thing this story is about. Because in Ashford, a father and a daughter once went 20 years without a single word, no letter, no call, no visit, no message passed through anyone. And they did it not because the love had died, but because each of them was waiting, all 20 of those years, for the other one to reach first. Ashford keeps its silences longer than its secrets. This is the longest one I know. When people hear a thing like that, 20 years, a father and daughter, not one word, they reach immediately for the worst. They assume there was a crime in it. Some betrayal too large to forgive, some cruelty, some unforgivable thing one of them did to the other. The kind of wound you understand a person walking away from forever. That is what the town assumed, on the rare occasions it thought about Arthur Vane and the daughter who had gone. There must have been something. You don't go 20 years over nothing. And I want to tell you, before we go any further, that the town was wrong, and wrong in a way that matters, because there was no crime in it at all. There was no betrayal, no cruelty, no unforgivable thing. There was only a small failure on one ordinary morning, and then 20 years of two frightened people, each protecting themselves from the other, which is a far more common story and a far sadder one, and one a great many people listening will recognize more than they would like to. You could have heard the wrong story being told about them at Eleanor's Diner any week you cared to listen. The way these things get told over coffee, half remembered, kindly meant, completely mistaken. Someone would mention that Arthur Vane had a daughter somewhere who never came, and someone else would nod and lower their voice and say, "Wasn't that a shame?" And a third would supply a reason, invented on the spot and passed along as fact. There'd been a falling out over the mother's will, perhaps, or the daughter had married someone the old man wouldn't have in the house, or Arthur had said something at the funeral that could never be taken back. None of it was true. But a town cannot abide a silence it doesn't understand, any more than it can abide an empty chair. And so it fills the silence with the most familiar furniture it owns, which is blame, and having filled it, forgets that it ever guessed, and starts believing its own guess. By the time this story actually ended, half of Ashford could have told you, with real conviction, the precise, unforgivable thing Arthur Vane had done. There was no precise, unforgivable thing. There was only what really happened, which no one had thought to imagine, because it was too quiet and too sad and too close to home. Arthur Vane was a man you would have walked past in Ashford 1,000 times and never thought about twice. He is 79 now. He has lived in the same narrow house off the Maple Street end of town for most of his life, and for the last 20 years of it, he has lived there alone. He is one of those men of his generation who were built to do and not to say, who would fix your gate in the rain without being asked, and could not, to save his life, tell you that he loved you. The love was real. It simply had no door to come out of. He showed it in petrol put in a car, in a roof patched, in money quietly left where it was needed and never mentioned again. And in his kitchen, on the wall by the back door, there has hung for 20 years an old corded telephone that for most of those years did not ring with the one voice he was waiting for. His daughter is called Claire. She is 51 now, which means she was 31 when the silence began, which means she has spent very nearly as much of her adult life not speaking to her father as she ever spent speaking to him. She left Ashford young, went off to build a life in a city a few hours away, married, had children, made a whole world for herself, far from the narrow house off Maple Street. The town, in the lazy way of towns, decided she had simply outgrown the place and her quiet father with it. The clever daughter who got out and didn't look back. That was the story Ashford told, when it told one at all. It was not true either. She looked back constantly. She just never knew how to turn around. To understand it, you have to go back 20 years to the spring that took Margaret. Margaret was Arthur's wife and Claire's mother, and she was the warm middle of that family, the one who said the things neither of the other two could say, who translated the father to the daughter and the daughter to the father, who held the whole arrangement together so quietly that no one noticed she was holding it until she was gone. She was the one who told Claire, when Claire was small and hurt, that her father hadn't praised some drawing, that he had pinned it up in the shed where he thought no one would see. She was the one who told Arthur what his daughter needed in a given week, because Arthur could no more read it himself than he could read Greek. For 30 years, Margaret had stood in the gap between two people who loved each other and could not, on their own, find the words. She had been the words the whole time, the living bridge they both walked across without ever noticing there was a river underneath. And then, over one hard spring, she was gone, and the two people she left behind found themselves standing on opposite banks of a sudden, terrible water with no bridge and no idea how to build one, and no notion, this is the cruelty of it, that the other one was standing on the far bank wanting exactly the same crossing. Years later, Claire would say it began at the funeral, though it would be truer to say it began in the days just after, in the terrible, flat quiet when the casseroles stop coming and the house goes still. She was drowning. She had lost her mother, and she needed her father, needed him to reach across and hold her, to say her mother's name, to grieve out loud with her, so that she was not grieving alone. And Arthur, who was drowning too in his own way, in the silent way he did everything, could not do it. He could not find the words. He could not reach. He stood at the kitchen counter that had been Margaret's, with his hands flat on the wood, and he said nothing, because the grief was so big in him that opening his mouth at all felt like it would let something out that he would never get back in. He thought he was holding himself together for his daughter's sake. She saw a father who, on the worst week of her life, had nothing to give her. And she packed her bag a day early, and she drove back to the city, and that was the morning it began. Neither of them did anything dramatic. That is the part people never believe. There was no scene, no shouted thing, no door slammed hard enough to crack the frame. There was just a daughter who left a day early because she could not bear one more silent meal, and a father who watched her go and told himself it was right that she go, that she had her own life, her own grief, and that he, standing there mute in his dead wife's kitchen, was only making it heavier. He let her leave because he loved her and thought she'd be lighter away from him. She left because she loved him and could not survive being unreached for one more day. And each of them drove away from that morning, carrying a story about the other that was completely wrong and would stay wrong for 20 years. His story was this: she is grieving her mother, and I remind her of everything she lost. And she has built a real life somewhere better. And the kindest thing I can do is not be a weight on it. Her story was this: he never needed me. He couldn't even reach for me when I was breaking. He doesn't want me there. Neither story was true. But you cannot argue with a story you tell yourself in private, because there is no one in the room to correct it. And so the first month passed without a call, and then the first season, and then the strange, dreadful first year. And somewhere in that first year, the silence stopped being an accident and became a thing with its own weight, a wall that had built itself brick by brick out of nothing but two people each waiting for the other to knock. What Arthur did not know, what Claire would not learn for 20 years, was how close he came, over and over, to calling. He kept her number on a card by the telephone the whole time, in Margaret's handwriting, because Margaret had written it there once, and he could not bring himself to take it down. There were evenings, more than he could count, when he stood in that kitchen with his hand on the receiver and a number half dialed, and put it down again. He almost called on every one of her birthdays. He marked them. He knew exactly how old she was turning every year, and he sat with that knowledge alone in the quiet and could not pick up the phone, because by year 3 the silence had grown so large that he was certain a call from him would only frighten her, or anger her, or remind her of grief she had surely put behind her, and that she would not want it. He was protecting her, he told himself, from a call she didn't want. He had no idea she was sitting by a phone of her own, a few hours away, waiting for it to ring. There was one evening in particular he has spoken about since, and it stands for all the others. It was her 40th birthday, year 9 of the silence, and he had known the date was coming for weeks, the way he always did, and he had told himself that 40 was a real milestone, that a man ought to be able to say happy birthday to his own child on a day like that he would do it this time. He waited until the evening. He stood at the wall by the back door with the card Margaret had written the number on, though he knew the number without it, and he dialed all but the last digit, and he stood there with his thumb over the last button and his heart going like a younger man's, and he tried to picture what he would say after she answered, and he could not picture it. He could only picture the silence on the line, his own and then hers, and her polite voice waiting for him to explain why he was calling after 9 years, and his own mouth failing him the way it had failed him at the kitchen counter the week Margaret died. So he set the receiver down, gently, the way you set down something you've decided you can't carry, and he sat back at the table in the dark, and that was her 40th birthday. He has said since that he does not think there is a worse feeling available to a person than standing with your thumb over the last digit of your own child's number and not being able to press it. He stood like that, by his reckoning, perhaps 50 times across 20 years. Because she was. That is the thing that breaks your heart about it, once you know. Claire kept his number too. She told herself every year that this would be the year, that she would call at Christmas, that she would drive up in the spring, that she would write the letter she had drafted a dozen times and never sent. She kept a chair, in a way, for a visit that never got arranged. She got as far, more than once, as dialing the first digits, and then she would imagine his voice going flat and distant on the line, imagine him not knowing what to say, imagine being unreached all over again, and she would put the phone down, because she could survive almost anything except picking up that receiver and discovering for certain that her father did not want to hear from her. So she protected herself by not calling, and every year she did not call, his silence looked more like proof that she had been right not to. The letter was the thing she got closest with. Somewhere in the middle years, she began one night to write it, the whole of it, everything she had never said, beginning with the morning she left early and how it had not been because she stopped needing him, but because she could not survive needing him and not being reached. She wrote it longhand, several pages, crying over it, and when it was done, she read it back. And it was true, and it was good, and she put it in an envelope and addressed it in her own hand to the narrow house of Maple Street. And then she did not post it. She kept it in a drawer. She would take it out some years and read it and almost walk it to the box at the corner and put it back, because a letter is a thing that cannot be taken back once it's gone. And what if it arrived and there was no answer? What if she sent her whole opened heart up the road to Ashford and got in return the silence she had been so carefully avoiding for years, now made final and certain? The unsent letter sat in that drawer for over a decade. She has it still. She showed it to her father in the end, and he read it at the kitchen table, slowly, twice. And what he said when he finished was that he had written her one almost exactly like it, in his head, 100 times, and had never been able to get the first line down on paper. 2 people, the same letter, neither one ever sent. This is the whole quiet engine of it, and it is worth saying plainly because it is so much more ordinary than betrayal. Neither of them was cold. Neither of them stopped loving the other for so much as a day. They were simply, both of them, frightened of exactly the same thing, of reaching out a hand and having it not be taken. And each of them read the other's matching fear as coldness. His silence to her was a closed door. Her silence to him was a closed door. And the truth was that behind both doors stood a person with their hand raised to knock, who had been standing there, hand raised, for years, listening for a knock from the other side that each was too afraid to be the first to give. You can add up what that costs over 20 years, and the sum is almost unbearable. So the town never did. There was a wedding, Claire's daughter married, and Claire did not invite her own father, not out of spite, but because she was so certain he would not come that she could not face the asking. And so a grandfather sat alone in a narrow house on the day his granddaughter married, not knowing it was happening a few hours up the road. There were grandchildren Arthur knew only as names he overheard second-hand, children who grew up with a grandfather who was a closed subject, a man in a town they'd never been to, a blank where a person should have been. There were school plays and birthdays and ordinary Sunday dinners, 20 years of them, that had a missing place at the table on both ends, and a name no one quite said. There were 20 Christmases set for one less than they should have been. There was the slow, private accounting each of them did, alone, late at night, of the years going by, and the particular ache of knowing the other one was out there, alive, reachable, a phone call away, and choosing, as far as each could tell, to stay gone. And there were the ordinary, uneventful years too, not the dramatic occasions, just the long, beige middle of 2 lives, the weather and the small news and the nothing much of being someone's family that simply went past, unshared, unrepeatable, gone. That is the real price of a silence like this, not the big missed occasions, though those are bad enough. The 7,000 ordinary days that no one will ever give either of them back. There's a detail most people miss about a silence of this kind, and it is the saddest detail there is. It is not that the two people stopped loving each other. It is that each of them was certain the silence was the other one's choice. Arthur believed for 20 years that Claire had let him go, that she had made her peace and built her life and did not want the disturbance of him. Claire believed for 20 years that Arthur had never really reached for her and never would. Each of them grieved a relationship they thought the other had ended, and all the while both of them were wrong, and both of them were waiting, and the only thing standing between them across 2 decades was that neither could bear to be the one who reached first and risked finding the door truly shut. It might have stayed that way to the end. These silences usually do, and they outlast the people who keep them and get buried with them, and become the thing a family doesn't talk about for another generation. What broke this one was small, the way these things are always small. Claire's own daughter had a baby that winter, Claire's first grandchild, Arthur's first great-grandchild, a great-granddaughter neither of them had any way to share. And one ordinary evening, Claire was sitting with that baby asleep on her chest, the small, impossible weight of her, and she found herself doing the arithmetic she had spent 20 years refusing to do. She worked out how old her father would be now. 79. She worked out how many years that probably left, and she understood, with the baby breathing against her, that the silence was no longer something happening to her. It was something she was choosing. Every single day she did not pick up the phone, and that one of these days, not far off now, the phone would ring with the news that it was too late, and the silence would become permanent. And she would have done that by waiting. So she did the bravest small thing a person can do. She got up, with the baby still warm against her, and before she could talk herself out of it the way she had 100 times before, she walked to the phone and she dialed the number she had known by heart for 20 years. Her hands were not steady. She held the receiver with both of them, the way you hold something you're afraid to drop. She did not have a speech. She had no idea what she would say if he answered, or what she would do if he didn't, or what she would do. This was the worst of it. If some stranger answered and told her she was 20 years too late. She just stood there in her kitchen with the phone against her ear, 51 years old and shaking like a girl. And she listened to it begin to ring in a kitchen a few hours away that she had not seen in 2 decades. And in that kitchen, off the Maple Street end of Ashford, the old corded phone on the wall by the back door began to ring, in the evening, when it never rang. Arthur was at the table. He almost did not answer it. That is the truth, and he has admitted it since. A phone ringing at that hour, for a man who got no calls, meant one of the few things, a wrong number or bad news. And he sat for 2 full rings with his heart going and did not move toward it because some old animal part of him did not want to know which it was. He almost let it ring out. He has thought about that since, about how close the whole of the rest of his life came to turning on whether a tired old man could be bothered to cross his own kitchen. But on the 4th ring, he got up, the way you do, and he lifted the receiver, and he said his name into it the flat, careful way he answered everything. and there was a silence on the line, a long one. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of someone on the other end who cannot speak yet. And then, very quietly, after 20 years, he heard his daughter say, "Dad?" I won't tell you everything that was said, because most of it was barely words at all, and some of it belongs to them. But I'll tell you the shape of it, because the shape is the whole point. They did not, either of them, deliver the speech they had been not giving for 20 years. There was no great accounting, no list of wrongs, no demand for apology. There was a long stretch where neither of them could get much out, and neither of them hung up, which after 20 years of silence is its own kind of conversation. And then, somewhere in it, one of them said the thing that broke it open. "I didn't think you'd want me to call." And there was a pause. And from the other end came, "I've been waiting 20 years for you too." And then, very fast, almost on top of each other, the same astonished sentence from both directions. "I thought you didn't want me." And the discovery, all at once, on a phone line on an ordinary evening, that the wall they had each spent 20 years standing behind, hand raised to knock, had never had anything on the other side of it but the other one, waiting in exactly the same posture for exactly the same knock. That is the reframe, and it is why I wanted to tell you this one. We hear 20 years of silence, and we build a villain. We assume cruelty or coldness or some unforgivable thing, because those are the categories we have for an estrangement that long. And sometimes, yes, those are the true ones. But far more often than anyone admits, because it is so much harder to say, the long silence is not made of hatred at all. It is made of fear and pride, that is really fear wearing better clothes, and two people each so certain of the other's coldness that they never find out it was never there. Arthur and Claire were not a hard man and a hard woman who finally softened. They were two soft, frightened, ordinary people who loved each other helplessly the entire time and could not, for 20 years, find the nerve to be the first to say so. There is no shame in that story. There is only loss. And the loss was never necessary, which is the part that takes your breath. What came after was quiet and small, and I think more moving for being so. She drove up that spring to the narrow house she had not stood in for 20 years, to the kitchen that had been her mother's, where her father now stood older and smaller than the man in her memory. They did not try to make up the 20 years, you can't, and they were both wise enough by then to know it. They did not relive the funeral or relitigate the morning she left early. They started from where they were, which is the only place anyone can ever start. They sat at Margaret's table and drank tea and talked, awkwardly at first and then less so, about nothing much. The town, the weather, who in Ashford had died and who was born. He met his great-granddaughter. He held the baby in those hands that had never learned to say, "I love you," and said it the only way he ever could, which was by holding her very carefully and not wanting to put her down. And Claire watched her father hold her granddaughter and understood, 20 years too late and just barely in time, that the man she had spent 2 decades believing didn't want her had wanted her the whole way through. They have the years they have left now, which is not the same as the years they lost, and they both know it. And they have decided not to spend the remaining ones grieving the gone ones, which is its own small act of courage and the right one. She comes up most months now. The old phone on the wall rings in the evenings sometimes, and he crosses the kitchen to answer it without that animal dread, because now he knows who it might be. Here is the thing the story leaves in the quiet, and I'll leave it there rather than say it for you. The phone call that ended 20 years of silence could have happened on any of the 7,000 evenings before the one it happened on. Nothing had changed. The number was the same number it had always been. The love was the same love. The fear was the same fear. The only thing that was different about that one ordinary evening was that someone finally dialed. That one of them decided the risk of reaching and being refused was no longer as terrible as the certainty of the silence going on. That is all it ever takes, and it is never small, and most of us know it. So I'll ask you the question I started with, but turned around. Who is the person you have not spoken to in too long? And, this is the harder half, what is the story you have been telling yourself about why the silence is their move and not yours? That they don't want to hear from you? That they're the one who should call? That too much time has passed and it would only be strange now? I'd ask you to notice that the person on the other end of your silence may be standing in their own kitchen, hand raised to a phone, telling themselves the very same story about you, and that the only way either of you will ever find out is if one of you decides to be the one who knocks. You don't have to have a speech. Arthur and Claire didn't. You only have to dial. Ashford keeps its silences longer than its secrets, but it does not always keep them forever. This one ended on an ordinary evening with a phone ringing in a quiet kitchen and an old man crossing the floor on the fourth ring and a frightened woman holding a receiver with both hands. There are other silences in this town still going, in other kitchens, waiting for their own fourth ring. We'll come back to them. There is more to Ashford than one evening can hold, and tomorrow there is a door to open, behind which a quiet man left a whole life no one knew he had. But tonight, if there's a number you know by heart and have not dialed in too long, I'd put this down and I'd think about it. The phone is right there. It has been the whole time.